John Leslie King is a professor at the University of Michigan and dean of the School of Information. And in a couple of months, he's going to be taking over a position as vice provost for academic information at the University of Michigan. And he'll be heading libraries, museums, information technology at the university. So it's absolutely real honor to have him here, particularly since I was a colleague of his back in the 1970s, the late 1974 to 1979. We were together at the University of California, Irvine, when we were doing research together. He was a PhD student at that time, and actually graduated in philosophy, but then did a doctorate in the School of Management at Irvine, and worked with another good colleague of both of ours, Ken Kramer, and we were part of what was later called the Irvine Group, as a euphemism. The Irvine School.
That was Rob's idea.
Rob Kling and others. So anyways, great experience, one of the greatest collaborative groups that I've been involved in for a long time prior to OII. And, but anyway, he was at Irvine as a professor and chair and headed the libraries there before he went to Michigan. And he was the second dean of the School of Information. So really delighted to have you here, John.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this, and that way I have the timer running. Okay. So you've seen the title of the talk. I just wanted to emphasize this is the United States, and even though what happens in the United States is generalizable without qualification to the rest of the world, and this is just focusing on the United States. I have a few other things to say about it. I stopped some time ago talking about what I have already done when I give talks, and instead I've moved entirely to talking about what I'm going to do. And the reason for this is if I don't make myself give talks about what I'm going to do, I don't do anything anymore. So it's a forcing function to get me to focus on that. As Bill said, I'm Dean and Professor in the School of Information. I'll remain a professor in the School of Information, but I'm moving into a new job, Vice Provost for Academic Information, and that job contains two roles. One is sort of libraries and information and communication technology, and the other one is working on the mission and vision components of institutional transformation, and it's the whole sectoral or enterprise transformation within the context of the academy. So I'm going to be talking about what I'm going to do in this regard. Second, I wanted to mention that I was here for the last few days on a review committee for the Oxford Internet Institute, which consisted entirely of people from the UK except me. And there was a very interesting sort of digressive discussion about the Rottweiler factor, which was, that it's really good to have a lot of kind of direct confrontation about the state of ideas and tearing people's ideas apart. And this was the Rottweiler thing. I finally figured that out. So that's good. So I want you to bite me, but I want you to wait, okay, until I'm done. And I also want you to suspend your disbelief and just assume that everything I say is true, okay? There's a reason for this. So the summary is, I haven't done the work yet, but what I say is true, and bite me, but wait till I'm done. Okay, so those are the kind of ground rules I'd like to proceed on, and this is a method to this madness, because this is a fairly high-speed, high-density talk. So one of the forewarnings I will give you is that this talk is about 3% text and about 97% images. And since images are worth 1,000 words, and there's already going to be a lot of words, it's going to be kind of a fire hose coming at you. But the whole purpose of this discussion is to try to get you a sense, what I would call it a sort of high-speed thought experiment about what I think is going on in higher education at this point, and why we have to adopt a different point of view about higher education. So I'm going to start with this cover of this book. This came out in 1993. Reengineering the Corporation. Michael Hammer and James Champy produced this book, wrote this book. And the important story is that these two guys came out of the IT world. They had been, for many years, consultants to large organizations working on how the organizations were using information technology. And they wrote this book around a common thread that underlie the experience of information technology as it was adopted and applied in complex organizations, which was, as often as not, the process of thinking through how to apply computers to complex organizational processes resulted in substantial benefit, even if you didn't ever end up applying the computers. It was a situation where you had basically rethought the problems and realized that the way you were doing the work really didn't make very much sense, so you made process reforms, and as a result, you got a lot of benefit out of it. And so they came up with this re-engineering the corporation idea. They made a lot of money off of it. If you want to get a copy now, you just go to book closeouts. It's basically a dead issue. Like many management fads, it burst up. But you talk about business process re-engineering now. It's, so 1995, and nobody wants to hear about it. But I want to argue that that phenomenon, that business process re-engineering phenomenon, was extremely important. And that, irrespective of what you may think about Hammer and Champion, how they put this idea together and, the consulting that grew out of it, they were onto something very important that is going to resurface as I go forward in this talk. So when we talk about information technology, we often have sort of mental images of this technology, but I want to argue that we're talking about something that's much broader. And Bill was saying during the review process, we consider the internet, the Oxford Internet Institute, we consider the internet very broadly defined, right? So I'm talking about information technology broadly defined. Everybody's seen the canonical, really, really fast growth of the internet. This is the host domain growth picture that we've all sort of been raised on in the last few years. Everybody remembers the dot-com boom. Everybody went berserk. Alan Greenspan put it was a period of irrational exuberance and so forth, and then it collapsed, and there was actually more Google Images material on the dot-com collapse than there was on the dot-com boom. So everybody loves a tragedy, and so there was that. And not too long after the collapse of the dot-com thing comes Nicholas Carr. This is Nicholas Carr, not Bill. And he wrote this book called IT Doesn't Matter. Actually wrote a Harvard Business Review article called IT Doesn't Matter, quickly followed by a book with the altered title, Does IT Matter? Because he got so beat up by saying IT doesn't matter that he figured that he would get more invitations from CIOs if he said, does IT matter? And basically his argument boiled down to a statement about productivity and infrastructure that I want to come back to in a minute. But basically his argument was that as information technology becomes more commodified, it becomes infrastructure. And these are his words, they're not mine. As it becomes infrastructure, it no longer matters. Right? So this is going to be our foreshadowing of the infrastructure discussion. So I will return to it in a minute. Now in the meantime, there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years, some of it by Professor David here in the room, and early visionary about what was happening with the so-called productivity paradox, which was the difficulty of finding in national accounts data and other sources correlation between investment in IT capital stock and improving productivity. And sure enough, around 1995, this was all retrospective, of course, but around 2000, they started to get the data from 95 to 2000, Dale Jorgensen and others, and began to show that there was a quite interesting a phenomenon going. This is from some of Jorgensen's work, and basically what it shows, it's kind of hard to read, it's a small screen, but there are different kinds of productivity. The red bar is labor quality. You can see that's not changing a huge amount. It's sort of declining as a factor in the productivity growth. Obviously, the overall size of the stack is the productivity growth. This is far left's 59 to 73, then 73 to 95, and then the far right is 95 to 2004, so it's a 10-year window. The light blue is other capital deepening, non-IT related capital deepening. The dark blue is IT capital deepening. See, that's going up over time. The white is non-IT total factor productivity. And then the yellow is IT-related total factor productivity. So, the argument is that IT really was having a major effect on productivity. It was in the numbers, and this cycle had come around. There's also some interesting work done by some folks. This is quite recent, 2006, here in in Europe. This is a really interesting conjecture. I'm just throwing it up because it's an interesting alternative point to make, which is that there's a relationship between use of IT and willingness to organize your operations differently. And what they were trying to show was some explanation for why this IT productivity link that Jorgensen and others had been able to show in the United States didn't seem to be happening to anywhere close to that extent in Europe. And what they were arguing is that it has to do with the willingness to decentralize operations. And in the United States, there's a willingness to decentralize operations in concert with IT application, and in Europe, there's less willingness to do that. And so, Europe's productivity benefits from IT of lag behind. Yeah, Nick Bloom. Yeah. Higher IT inputs lead to higher productivity, particularly in the more decentralized U.S. So that's sort of the theme there. So what I'm doing is linking the IT and productivity thing to organizational change, willingness to change. And then there's this really interesting thing which Kevin Stroh at the New York Fed did with Dale Jorgensen and some others. And this is as of a couple of months ago, March 2006. And what they're arguing is that there are actually two periods of productivity change since 1995. They call them two surges, okay? And the first surge from basically 95 to 2000 is on the left, and the second surge from 2000 to now, more or less, is on the right. And well, it's really hard to read these things, so let me just tell you the gist of this. What it says is that direct application of IT, which you might call something similar to capital labor substitution payoffs, really started kicking in between 95 and 2000. But the largest increase in productivity resulting from 2000 to 2005 is that gray bar called reallocation. So it was the redistribution of organizational resources that was contributing to the productivity gains in the last 5 years, right? Now, you don't have to be all that creative to kind of make a story out of this, right? That, there's this disequilibration of the application of IT to existing ways of doing things. This goes back to Paul's article about the computer and the dynamo. Then there is a period of what you might call low-hanging fruit gains, where you're able to make substitutions and capitalize on that. But then there's this kind of, I would argue, kind of reorganization, business process reengineering phenomenon, where you begin to realize, the way we've been going about doing these things doesn't make as much sense as this alternative, and you begin to reallocate your resources toward new ways of doing things. And they might, in many cases, be new ways of doing things, even though the ultimate thing that you're doing is relatively the same. But it's a really different way of approaching the problem. Or it, in fact, might be a different place in the value proposition than you were previously operating. You're actually doing something different that has a higher value, and your resources are getting more of a return. So decentralization, reallocation, productivity, I just put those words up there to kind of freeze those in your head, because those are important. Now there's three other things which are really the core of this discussion, which are infrastructure, agency, and access. So this talk is going to turn on those three issues. And let me start off with the general issue of infrastructure. This is from what I think is probably the most intelligent short paper on understanding the complexities of infrastructure, Lee Starr and Karen Roulater's paper in Information Systems Research in 1996 called Steps Toward an Ecology of Infrastructure. And they made a list of attributes of infrastructure that are important, and this is just a subset of those that are important to our topic here. It's embedded. It's often, quote, embedded out of view. It embodies standards. Standards in infrastructure are very tightly coupled. You have to learn the use of infrastructure to gain access to communities of practice that depend on infrastructure. A very simple example is driving an automobile. It's not enough just to learn how to operate the machine. You have to learn all kinds of not only technical infrastructure, but social infrastructure about social conventions and driving. For example, you all drive on the same side of the road, right? An issue for people from North America who move here, for example. Um, Infrastructure is visible only on breakdown. In other words, it's invisible until it breaks. A big problem for it. And the main reason is most people have no conception of how important infrastructure is. They think, like Nicholas Carr, that things become infrastructure and they no longer matter. Right? Well, in fact, only the most important things in society ever make it to infrastructure status. And if you want to take a very simplistic analysis of that, just ask how much money we spend on it. We spend more money year after year on infrastructure than just about anything else in the society. Transport would be a good example. Most people don't think of transport as a sector, but if you take the transport sector as a whole, it's actually a larger sector of US GDP than healthcare at this point. It's 17% of GDP. But most people don't think of it that way, right? So, and transport's almost entirely complementary in production. So infrastructure is very important. Just because it disappears doesn't mean it's not important. And finally, it mediates between global and local. And this is, I have the mediates underlined there because this notion of mediation is sort of the core issue when we talk about the relationship between infrastructure, agency, and access. So this talk is based on my examinations of a very small sample, completely opportunistic, of organizations, the latest one being Oxford, which is sort of floating in from the side, and it's not even something I intended. It's just something that's happened because over the last several days in talking to people about this, I have repeatedly heard the introductory phrase, well, here at Oxford, and then ... And it's almost always what I would call Oxford exceptionalism. It may be genuinely exceptional, but it's a data point, right? So University of California hung out in for a long time. I know the place pretty well. University of Michigan, I've been at quite a while. I was at the Harvard Business School for a short, sort of participant observation, going native anthropological experience. I was at Frankfurt University in a similar vein for a short time. Spent some time trying to figure out how those places worked. And I've had, the grand total of a day and a half to get the deep experience of what Oxford's like. So I don't even pretend that this is a comprehensive view of higher education, but it's one that I'm just starting to build some we might call grounded theory from. So let's just look back briefly at the history of the Academy. There's a lot of different histories of the Academy. You can get different points of view on it, but the Academy is an old thing. In its current form, it's probably traceable back over 1,000 years. There's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that there was something that was very much like a university that was operating in India 2,700 years ago. There's not a lot left of a trace of this thing, but enough to suggest that there was actually a highly organized institutional kind of thing like a university. But the one that we think of as the university probably goes back to Al-Azhar in Cairo, which was started in 970, 969, 970. And then since then, Bologna, Oxford, et cetera, are the institutions that grew up and resulted in what we now have as the Academy in the West, as we're familiar with it. I would argue that the Western Academy is actually sort of directly traceable to the Fall of Toledo in 1085. And Toledo was an important place. Toledo was actually the center of learning of the Visigoth Empire. It was the center of origin of the Visigoth Code of Law, which was a quite important early concept of jurisprudence. There were most of the people who were literate in the Visigoth Empire lived in the Toledo region. In the 8th century, the Umayyad dynasty, the Moors from across the water, the Islamic Empire, came and colonized most of the Iberian Peninsula. And Toledo became a center of one of the great libraries of the Islamic world. And as you're probably aware, most of the documents of classical civilization, Greek and Roman civilization, were destroyed outside of the Islamic world. They were preserved in the Islamic world, and they were preserved in libraries like the library at Toledo. Now, when Toledo fell to the Christian forces in the end of the 11th century, not only the library and all of its contents, but all of the infrastructure of literate people, scribes, those who were familiar with documentation, those who understood its use in production, were essentially captured intact. And of course, as was the wont at the time, you sort of became whatever religion of the people who conquered you, and they all became Catholic. And they translated all of these works, and the vast majority of them, into Latin, and they began to circulate throughout Christian Europe. And one of the early things that happened as a result of that was the re-establishment of the classical concept of education built around the trivium, which was grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, which was music, astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry. And these became what we now think of as the liberal arts. The trivium and the quadrivium are the foundation of the liberal arts. And this concept of the trivium and the quadrivium, which was drawn directly from the classical education model, was built into institutions like this one and those that followed as the sort of organizing paradigm of what it meant to be highly educated as compared to, say, merely literate or whatever. This, for example, is a very nice engraving of God using geometry to create the world, right? So it wasn't just basic knowledge, it was applied, right? There was a notion of application that was quite deeply embedded in this. And of course, there was a flowering of knowledge. Averroes, for example, who was an Islamic scholar, postulated that you couldn't understand the world by using the same intellectual tools you use to understand the divine, right? And so he argued for separation in method between the understanding of the divine and the understanding of the nature of the world. And this was actually adopted by Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas successfully prosecuted this argument and made the first establishment of this idea in the history of the Catholic Church. And he was Dr. Angelicus. And he was the one who sort of established the Catholic tradition, Roman Catholic tradition, of what you might call worldly knowledge as a legitimate line of work. And in fact, it was a form of praise to God. Roger Bacon came into this picture and began to introduce concepts of empiricism and so forth. And the whole flowering of the Renaissance, with the whole cast of characters, essentially picked this set of ideas up that came from classical antiquity and began to instantiate them throughout Europe in the form of these emergent organizations that we now call universities. So if you look at the universities emergent around the 12th century, they had an interesting characteristic. They were essentially ecclesiastical institutions. In fact, there's a plaque around here somewhere. I've been looking for it, and maybe it's gone now, but I found it some years ago when I was wandering around Oxford that said, on this site stood some really early building of Oxford. And in those days, everybody took a form of holy orders, not the servants and stuff. But if you were at all a participant in the intellectual life of the academy, you took a form of holy orders, celibate and so forth. And this was what I call the Roach Motel era of the academy. You went in, you didn't come out, right? The academy was essentially a cloister. The academy was a calling to which you went, and not entirely, but the idea was that the academy was, to a substantial extent, a contemplative world. Now, of course, there was discourse and commerce, just like there was among the ecclesiastical institutions, monasteries, people traveled among them, and so forth and so on. But for a very long period of time, the notion that the contemplative academic life was separable from a lot of the rest of life sort of held sway. And in many institutional contexts, there's some differences in this, but it's not an accident, for example, that it took a long time for the oldest of universities to adopt the idea that professional education was something that they had to make substantial investments in. So this was a fairly stable period for a fairly long time, in which the university played an important role, but it wouldn't be what you would call a fine grain and routine role at all levels of society. It was at a fairly high level of society, and the society was highly stratified at the time, of course. Now, this began to change quite dramatically in one of the first big infrastructure-based disequilibrations, which of course was the invention of printing. Now, there's been lots of written and lots of discussion about the nature of printing's influence on the academy. But the thing that I want to focus on is not the story of direct access to material and so forth. I want to point out that Johannes Gutenberg's first paid commission as a printer in Mainz was to print letters of indulgence for the Archbishop of Mainz. And you might recall that about the same time, there was a figure, Martin Luther, who appeared on the scene, who had a real problem with the Roman Catholic Church's practice of granting indulgences for compensation. And Luther's concern was not the first order corruption of the church. He was concerned about the systematic corruption of the church. And in particular, and in following the emergent notions of the Enlightenment, his argument was that the clergy become corrupted because they hold the power of access to salvation. So the story of the printing press that I think is particularly important here is that the printing press made it possible to actually implement Luther's most radical proposition, which was the disintermediation of the clergy from the access of the average person to salvation. And Luther's great comment was, every man his own priest. Right? So you have to ask, if you're going to substitute the liturgy, the celebration, and, well, essentially the embodiment of the mystery of the faith that's contained in the liturgy on the one hand, with the direct counsel of the clergy, if you're going to substitute that with something else that does not empower the clergy, what is it going to be? It's going to be direct access to Scripture. So direct access to Scripture required two things. First of all, it required a lot of copies of Scripture, but it also required much wider spread literacy. And so a huge boost to literacy, it's not unique to the Christian world, it also occurred in the Muslim world, but a huge boost to literacy was the concept of salvation mediated through being able to read the Scriptures. And the spread of, on the first order, printing, which of course quickly spread to the printing of all kinds of materials, not just Bibles and so forth, but everything that could be printed. And secondarily, this kind of heretical notion of the disintermediation of the clergy from this enormously important notion of salvation and all the subsequent political change that followed that, and the wars that surrounded the Reformation and the altered political climate that came from that, really began to stimulate a lot of rethinking about the fundamental role of contemplative knowledge. And the shift that really began to emerge was a shift from theology, which for a long period of time had held the center position in the academy as sort of the highest calling, with the others sort of descendant from that, away from the study of God and the nature of man's relationship to God, to the study of man and man's relationship with the world. And this became a particularly important part of what Francis Bacon contributed. And there's a very interesting example of this from an entertainment he wrote called Gesta Graeorum. Everybody kind of thinks he wrote it. There's actually less than perfect evidence that he did, in fact, write it, but circumstantially it seems he did. In which, among other things, there's a character in this play who's talking to a prince, and he's telling the prince what the prince has to get together in order to become a learned person. This is sort of the infrastructure of learning. You need a library, you need a wonderful garden, you need a stable for rare beasts and rare birds, you need 2 ponds, one for salt water, one for fresh, you need a goodly huge cabinet for all kinds of artifacts, and you need a still house with mills, instruments, furnaces, and vessels. Well, we don't know what some of these things mean, so translating them, we know what libraries are. A garden's a botanical or medicinal garden, which was a very important emergent thing in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. A stable's a zoo. Ponds are aquaria. A cabinet is a museum. And a still house is a laboratory. Well, this starts to sound a lot like a university, right? So by the end of the 16th century, this notion that there's actually something called an educational or learning production system is being codified. It's kind of showing up in strange places like this play, but the idea that there's a laundry list of things you have to have in order to build a production system that delivers on this. Now, several years ago, Paul and Dominic Foray roped me and Margaret Hedstrom into writing a paper on what we eventually called epistemic infrastructure. And what we looked at was libraries, archives, and museums in the production of these this sort of production system infrastructure of knowledge. And it was quite interesting. It was one of those wonderful opportunistic sampling opportunities in which Margaret knows a lot about archives and libraries, and I had to write something because I was a co-author. So I decided to do museums, and the meeting was held at the Randolph. And I thought, where, oh where, can I learn about museums? And it turns out that right across the street was the Ashmolean. So I went across the street, and guess what? There were some books on, history of the Ashmolean Museum, and I started reading them. And then I got really interested in this topic, and I started reading more and more about it. And after a while, I knew enough to bore you to tears about museums. So this whole idea of the relationship between systematic collecting and learning became a key focus of this paper. And I focused on the Ashmolean because it is the longest existing scientific museum in the world. And so it was kind of a good example. During this period when John Tredescant and his son were systematically collecting, they were gardeners. They were gardeners to the royal families of Great Britain. And they had been systematic collectors of plants, and they were assembling very large collections of plants, and they branched out into other artifacts. And at one point, because of their connections to the crown, they were able to get the crown to issue orders to the Admiralty. And, by the way, this was during the era of exploration and the emergence of the empire, right? So there were a lot of, voyages to the New World and so forth, that they were able to issue orders to the Admiralty that the captains of ships were to bring back anything strange that they found. And they would bring them back, and they would end up with the Tredescants, and the Tredescants would put them together, and they created something called Tredescants Rarities, right, which is a large collection of things that were put on display, actually, here in London, as an entertainment called the Ark, and they would charge admission for people to go see this thing. Well, Elias Ashmole, who had been trained as a lawyer at Oxford, became very interested in this, and he had a colleague, persuaded Tredescant Sr. to allow him to catalog the entire collection. So they wrote a catalog, detailed explanation catalog, every single item in the collection, and it was published under the title Museum Tredescantianum. When this began to circulate, it was printed and circulated, not a huge number of copies, but enough for it to start moving around. All of the other people who owned what were called cabinets of curiosity, or Wunderkammern, in Europe, got the idea that they ought to catalog their collections too. This was a very cool idea. It's a hobby world, right? And so these people could exchange information about their hobby. And these collection catalogs began to circulate. The ones that first began to circulate very systematically and began to be refined were catalogs of mollusks, because mollusks are very durable items, right? So they're very easy to collect. So the shells of the mollusks were collected systematically. And as these collections, catalog collections began to circulate, they began to be illustrated and so forth, people began to dispute and resolve disputes about how to classify these things. And this was the beginning of scholarly communication in the descriptive natural sciences. Systematic scholarly communication, where people began to agree, disagree, and finally come to some sort of synthesis of understanding of how you would classify these things. And of course that eventually led to Linnaeus and the development of the classification of flora and fauna and so forth, which we still use, more or less today. Ashmole ended up taking possession of the Tredescant collection, and at one point decided that he couldn't do anything further with it, and he gave it to Oxford. It became the Ashmolean Museum, and it's still here today. And this is just an engraving from the early 19th century of what was in the Ashmolean. And of course, the collections have grown very substantially since. But a lot of the stuff in the Ashmolean collection was part of the original Tredescan collection. So it's, a lot of the place is shut down right now for renovations. But when it's opened up again, go over and wander around, and they'll actually tell you which parts are part of the Tredescan collection. So it's quite interesting. The similar thing happened here at Oxford again with the Bodleian Library. Thomas Bodley made a deal with the Stationers Guild in London to receive certain copies of everything that was printed by the Stationers Guild and to hold them, right? And those became, in a sense, a depository library. And that collection was the core collection that eventually became the Bodleian Library. And then there were a bunch of other things that happened, like the Statute of Anne and other things, the emergence of copyright, the whole idea of original provenance and documents and so forth and so on began to evolve out of that period. I argue that all of this is a form of infrastructure of knowledge, right? It's particularly epistemic infrastructure. And by epistemic infrastructure, what Margaret and I have meant is codifiable knowledge that can be transmitted through what Bruno Latour calls immutable mobiles, books and articles and other things, text descriptions, pictures, etc., so that an understanding of these things can be acquired remotely and the knowledge can be stored for indefinite periods of time and accessed by people who want access to it. Okay, so during this period, there was a kind of transformation in what I would call the sort of production system role of the university from a student standpoint, where larger and larger numbers of young gentlemen began to go to the university and stay there for a period of time. And there were a variety of reasons why this happened, but one of them was that this was the emergent age of empire, and and also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and this was a mechanism by which the sons of the elite would start to be prepared to take their roles as leaders in the age of empire and in the age of industry. And so the university became a kind of refinery for gentlemen, the preparation zone for people who would take on certain roles in the society which went beyond the traditional roles that the academy had prepared people to take as clergy and sort of advisory roles. They would become military officers. This was the era in which the concept of a college education began to be correlated with the attributes of an officer, which is now not universal, but it's very widely established in the world that you are not likely to be a commissioned officer unless you have a college education. That's certainly true in the United States. You're not likely to be an important office holder if you don't have a higher education. So that began to emerge. And it wasn't, just in the more traditional UK or European schools. This is just a very early picture of the Harvard Divinity School. I mean, it was instantiated in the early institutions of higher education in the United States. It was also the case that people found new ways of communicating what they knew. The exhaustive processes of creating and circulating catalogs, or as in the case of scientists and scholars just doing direct communication with one another. This thing in the middle there is actually a letter from Robert Boyle to Robert Hooke. And this is how scientists communicated. Well, I did these things, and this is what I found out, signed Bob, and, went off. And these things might or might not circulate further. They might or might not be discussed further. In 1645, Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke and others got together and created an organization to facilitate this, the Royal Society. And the Royal Society began to collect these letters and print them, right? And then began to edit them and to make them more uniform and so forth. And Philosophical Transactions was arguably the first academic journal that began regular publication and began circulating widely. And of course, this was then a huge improvement in the infrastructure of communication, particularly the epistemic infrastructure, because you could begin to create an archival base of knowledge. These were generally published documents. They could be held in repository form and shared by people in university libraries and so forth. And of course, this continues to this day in all the different modalities of scholarly publication with which which we are familiar. Also happening around this period was the Industrial Revolution. There's different points of view on the relationship between scientific discovery and the scientific revolution and the Industrial Revolution, but from a co-evolutionary perspective, I think it's fair to say that at the intersection of the sort of engineering-oriented experimental discovery modality, learning by doing, and the more theoretically based and experimental scientific world, there began to be a lot of very practical implications of this. Just one, which is illustrated in this set of pictures, was the harnessing of the thermal gradient and the ability to turn fuel, like wood or coal or whatever, into steam, and then harness the power of the steam to do things like pump water with the Newcomen engine, or the cotton gin, or the train, or the steamship, or drive factories. Well, if you jump forward a little bit, you sort of start putting this puzzle together. You see that we now have a relationship between the world of knowledge generation and knowledge transmission in the form that the university had increasingly become good at, and the development of industry, the development of empire, the improvement of military capability and capacity, and in a sense, the recognition of the general utility of higher education in the society. And there was a profound shift around the middle of the 19th century in which the state began to realize that it couldn't afford to be without this thing, and it needed it at a larger scale. And this was particularly pronounced in the United States. It wasn't only in the United States. The Prussian Empire obviously had an understanding of this and so forth. And it wasn't just at higher education. But the poster child of this was the Land-Grant Colleges and Universities Act of 1863 in the United States, the so-called Morrill Act, which provided a grant of federal land to every state, the purpose of which was to create, and this is a quote from the act, at least one college where the leading object shall be, without excluding other scientific and classical studies and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts. So an explicit instruction of the Land-Grant Colleges and Universities Act was that you had to have schools of agriculture, scientific agriculture, and you had to have schools of engineering. So, just to give you an example of why this is important, the University of Michigan predates this. So the University of Michigan was not a land-grant institution. It was created in 1817 and really kind of happened in 1837. This was 1863. The University of Michigan would not deign to have an agriculture school because agriculture was not the province of the academy. The farmers, in a fit of rage at this, decided, well, hell, we'll build our own. And they created Michigan Agricultural College, which is now Michigan State. And Michigan State is the land-grant institution. It was the one that sort of said, well, you have to throw that money to us because these guys aren't going to make an ag school. And that's what happened. And so Michigan and Michigan State are sort of this binary star in the middle of Michigan, where the University of Michigan is the more pure and elite model, and Michigan State's the clodbusters, and then we duke it out on the gridiron. So there were a large number of these institutions. I mean, this was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, and before very long, there were actually quite a few of these things getting started. Minnesota, California, Michigan, Michigan State, West Virginia, New Hampshire, Dartmouth's the land-grant school. And these things began to grow quite aggressively. This is a more contemporary picture, but it gives you some sense of the expansion. Blue dots were the number of land-grant institutions by 1862, and then the red ones by 1890, and the square ones by 1994. There's quite a few of them. This is just a picture of the state of Pennsylvania, showing what Penn State University's presence is as a land-grant institution in the state of Pennsylvania, and the answer is every county. Every single county has a Penn State presence, either through agricultural extension or some other mechanism. This is also true in the state of California with the University of California, which is the land-grant institution. So you see the higher education suddenly was becoming very fine-grained. It was like operating down at the county level. Now, it may have been doing things like agriculture that people in the astronomy group or the physics group or the classical scholarship group didn't even know existed. And actually, if you ask the average University of California member right now, if the University of California does agricultural extension, they'll tell you no, when in fact it's an enormous enterprise, and the answer is yes. But it's two worlds, but it's still there, it's still part of this deal. Now, there's another element of infrastructure that I want to bring into this discussion, which is very important to the land-grant university phenomenon, and that is the railroad. I just did a little kind of equivalent of a back-of-the-envelope study, and I looked at the so-called Big Ten schools. Michigan is part of the Big Ten, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, etc. And I separated out those that were created in an urban area like Northwestern. It was in Evanston, which was a suburb of Chicago even way back when. And looked at the ones that were located in more rural environments like Ann Arbor was, or Urbana-Champaign, or Bloomington, Indiana, or West Lafayette, Indiana. And I just looked at when the railroad arrived and when the campus was created. And the railroad arrived first in every instance, and the campus was created within 10 years. Right? Now, could be just correlation, maybe not causality, but when you think about it, it stands to reason. Because the idea behind the land-grant institution was you're going to have a lot of people going and then a lot of people coming back, right? So there had to be some sort of fairly wide bandwidth channel to move people and, not incidentally, materials back and forth in some sort of network. There had to be a circulation capacity. And of course, the railroad was accompanied by the telegraph and so forth and so on. And this is I haven't yet found a single exception. I've just been sort of checking as I go, but I haven't found a single exception of an institution of higher education that was created in a rural area prior to the era of the railroad. Not one that grew of any substantial size. There were small sort of religious colleges and so forth that might be located on a main road, cross-country road, but there were virtually no major universities. So the railroad is just an instance of a very powerful infrastructure which became important to this transforming age of higher education. Now that's just a point. Obviously, we grew and grew institutions of higher education. This is all pictures of the University of Michigan. Of course, we added football. And then the next big clade, and I would actually call this not so much a departure point, but a kind of reinforcement of what happened with the Land-Grant Colleges and Universities Act, was the so-called Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which is also known as the GI Bill of Rights. And this was not created entirely or even mostly to facilitate higher education access by U.S. servicemen. As the title implies, Servicemen's Readjustment Act. This was an effort by the federal government to avoid the catastrophe that had followed World War I. When the returning American soldiers arrived in the United States after World War I, there was a recession, and there was huge unemployment problems, and there was a massive expectation failure, disconnect, where these soldiers just were furious that they couldn't find work, and there was, the government wouldn't support them. And in fact, there was famous instances in which General Sherman marched on a very large encampment of these World War I veterans, and beat a lot of them, and some of them were killed and so forth to clear them out of Washington, D.C., to drive them out because they were there protesting. So this was a big deal. 7 million veterans went to college as a result of this thing. And by 1946, more than half of all college enrollments in the United States were veterans, using the benefits of the GI Bill to go to school. So this had a tremendous effect on American higher education that lasted actually for several decades after that, of pumping enormous amounts of government resources, usually through the mechanisms of, in effect, entitlement grants to the vets that they could spend at these colleges, which was the beginning of the sort of federal and state financial aid programs of today in the United States. And just lifting the capacity up dramatically. So Bill and I were at UC Irvine. Irvine was a direct consequence of the GI Bill in the sense that the University of California received a huge influx of these veterans following the Second World War, and the University of California and the state of California said, why stop here? Right? I mean, what this proves is that a large fraction of the population can go to college. That's a good idea. We should make that happen. Let's build more campuses, and 3 new campuses, San Diego, Santa Cruz, and Irvine, were created as a result. So up to this point, I've been talking about this epistemic infrastructure, the knowledge that can be codified and so forth. There is a component of this that's equally important, in some cases more important because it's less often recognized, and that's what, for lack of a better term, I'm calling praxis infrastructure. This is the deep knowledge, often tacit knowledge, that exists in the society and is transmitted primarily through association, apprenticeships, internships, other direct mechanisms of transfer. One of the things that our school has traditionally done is librarianship. An ironic fact is if you go into a large academic library and look for the section on library and information science, it's the size of a postage stamp. It's like totally small. And that's because this field is not a field that has much of a presence in epistemic infrastructure. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge in the library world, but an awful lot of it is oral culture. An awful lot of it is not in formal documents, and it's in distributed documents. Paul and I were discussing this the other night. The organization of the books on the shelves is a kind of knowledge. The notations in card catalogs is a kind of knowledge, right? Not accessible to everyone, but it's there, right? The scholia in documents, the marginal notes that are made in documents is a kind of knowledge. So there are a lot of fields like this. I mean, a good example is nobody would, in their right mind, go to have their brain operated on by a neurosurgeon who had never done any neurosurgery, but just read a lot about it, right? It wouldn't make sense. It's a praxis phenomenon, right? So actually what you want is the brain surgeon who does a lot of brain surgery, so there's a statistical distribution of performance and a lot of practice, right? Hopefully recently. So this praxis infrastructure is not very well captured in this, but it is present in the academy in a lot of important ways. An awful lot of engineering is grounded in praxis understanding. Now, they're engineers, formal engineering training, and requires mathematics and physics and these other things. But there's a great plaque outside one of the University of Michigan's engineering buildings. Michigan was one of the early university-based engineering colleges. It's a very big college, very, very strong. And it's a quote from some professor, like in 1890. This is a very famous quote. Young man, when theory and practice conflict, use your horse sense. Right? This is not a plaque you would find on the site of the Institute for Theoretical Physics. Right? But it means something to engineers. They understand what this is about. Now, knowledge infrastructure is kind of an umbrella term that I put around all of this. And I don't mean to make a detailed brief about knowledge infrastructure, but the core argument here is that higher education is basically a production system that's based on knowledge infrastructure, and that we need to start doing what Jeff Bowker calls infrastructural inversion. We need to start disinterring and turning upside down the infrastructure on which we've been dependent for a very long time, because that infrastructure is changing quite dramatically. I won't go into the details of these changes in higher education, but there's been a lot of philosophical change going on here. Now, I just want to click to this thing real quick. This picture was not invented for this purpose, but I use it for this purpose. This is a picture called the Rectangularization of Mortality. This just shows what happened in the 20th century in the United States. Basically, this is the number of survivors out of 100,000 born alive at any given age. Right? So the amber line is almost a hypotenuse of a triangle, right? You see a very steep infant mortality slope, and then it kind of just smooths out and glides down to the lower corner, and by around age 85, pretty much everybody's dead, right? Well, then you look at the red line, it's moved out and up to the right, and then the blue line further, and then the kind of olive colored line even further. The number of years that people could work almost doubled, because all of that additional life is on the back end, right? The working population increased dramatically, productivity increased dramatically, capital investment increased by a factor of 10, inflation adjusted, and personal income increased in round numbers by a factor of 10, inflation adjusted. These were huge changes, more wealth, more years of life, more years of work, and more years of learning, right? So times have changed now, right? So then I'm going to fast forward. This is kind of a break in the story, and we're now going to look at the current state of American higher education. This is particularly focused on public higher education, because that's the world I live in, and it's the one that I'm worried about at the moment. But there are private sector analogs to these issues. This is a very interesting picture that I found from Illinois State University Center for Higher Education Studies. There's a lot going on in this picture, but the gist of it is this. This is the public student FTE enrollment over time. This is 2003 down here, okay? This is periods of state-level recession, economic recession. And this curve is the state tax appropriation as a function of student FTEs, right? And right now, we're here, right? There was the Bush recession in the early 2000s. The revenue allocation dropped precipitously. The number of students coming in went up quite dramatically, but it gets worse. This is what the public sees. The public sees cost of higher education going up, 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 up. It doesn't even matter if it's inflation adjusted. But what they see is that it goes up and up. My daughter is a student at the University of Michigan, and her tuition went up $1,200 last year. I mean, we still think it's worthwhile, but it's something we noticed. Obviously, private four-year education has gone up very substantially, but the public higher education has been rising significantly. This picture is annual percentage increase in consumer price indexes and tuition charged by type of institution from 77, 78 through 98, 99, and it's been going up even more since, and just, approximately, curve fitting. I mean, this is the moral of the story, right? Your rate of change in the red line, which is tuition, is higher than your rate of change in the blue line, which is CPI. So if you are a demagogic state legislature who has an axe to grind with public higher education, your question is going to be, why are your prices going up so much faster than CPI, so much faster than inflation? Well, it's not a new story. I mean, this story has been around for a long time. Right? Going back to 1947, President's Commission on Higher Education, had a whole chapter on the rising cost of higher education. And all of these various things since then have focused on this problem. So there's nothing new here, but it's a persistent refrain. But it's become pretty intense lately. For example, there is a U.S. Department of Education special commission put together by Secretary Margaret Spellings that has been looking at the future of higher education. An awful lot of it is focused on this issue. Because it's a Republican administration and there's a particular consciousness about this, their sort of modus operandi is to bring in corporate executives to tell higher education what's wrong, right? And, they have a lot to say. And the kind of, it's important to understand that what the Bush administration has been trying to do with this, now they've been failing to do it at the level they want to do it, but what they're really trying to do is do to higher education what they already did through K-12 through the No Child Left Behind Act. And the magic word is accountability, right? We want you to tell us, first of all, what you've done with the money that we gave you, and secondly, why you deserve to have any more, and of course, implicitly, why we shouldn't just cut you, reduce your funding, explain yourselves. Well, this has actually created a terrific agency problem. If you look at a state like Michigan, and I just put Michigan and Michigan State up as two kind of exemplary cases, the kind of notion around which higher education was organized was this idea that if you had an educated population, the economic welfare of the state would improve, right? So there would be a return on the investment of having educated students. And so the agency relationship was between the commonweal and the student. And basically it was, we're going to give you a very expensive education at a dramatic discount, which is equivalent to paying you to get this education. Now, in order to make that happen, you've got to have something that actually does the education. That, of course, is the university and the faculty, right? And so the idea is we'll give you guys money, you create the educational environment that these guys go to and benefit from and then generate revenue that raises the economic welfare of the state. So what you have is an agency relationship between the state and the university and the faculty, and another agency relationship between the state and the student. And these people kind of know that they have a relationship here. These people don't even know what agency relationships mean, right? And the really interesting question is, what's the agency relationship here? Well, in the past, it was sort of like Soviet labor, right? They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. And as my colleague Robin Fleming, the former president of the University of Michigan, quipped, undergraduate education was the only field of business where the customer works so hard to not get what they pay for, right? But now that the household, the student in the household is increasingly paying a larger fraction of the cost of attending this thing, these people are starting to think about this, and they're starting to look at these people and say, you know, we have an agency relationship with you, and here's how it works. We're customers, and the customer's always right. Hey, what's not to like, right? The faculty are saying, no, that's not how it works. You misunderstood. And that's about where we are in the evolution of this in the United States right now. But this is a big issue. How do you manage that agency relationship in public universities between essentially the faculty, the governance of the institution, and the students? The private universities have actually done a much better job of this over time. But a lot of what they do can't be scaled to public universities. Because generally speaking, the strong private universities are much smaller than the strong public universities. And there are big scale issues. The University of Michigan is one of the top ranked public universities. There isn't a top ranked private university that's anywhere close to the size of the University of Michigan. Same is true of Berkeley, same is true of UVA. I mean, there are big issues there. So this is actually a clip from an email Susan sent me a while back. From a friend at a university that was putting in this faculty accountability stuff where you were required to fill out these forms. I just thought I'd put it up because you might recognize the syndrome. The complete rejection of any quantification procedure and any numerical representation fails to capture the awesomeness of what I do, right? And the second one, so-and-so and I get the same score. And he didn't even publish in 4 top-tier journals, and I did, you know, it's unfair. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what happens when you start telling faculty there's going to be accountability, right? Everybody is afraid of this. Just a few other interesting factoids. These are based on survey data that were collected in the state of Michigan, public opinion polling data. 1992, the question was, is higher education a public good or a private good? About 2/3 said it was a public good. In 2002, 2/3 said it was a private good. That's a huge shift in consciousness. This is really an astonishing one. This is, of all baccalaureate degrees granted in 2005, nearly 60% were obtained by people who attended more than one institution. So it's approaching 2/3, right, that of people who receive a baccalaureate degree, attend more than one institution in the process of doing so. And of those who attend more than one institution, the mean is higher than 2, right? So more and more people are getting their college education by going to more than one institution. And even more interestingly, the idea of the residential college as the way people got higher education, that's over. That's only 18% of all the baccalaureate degrees granted were people who went to residential institutions. The fastest growing universities in the country, public and private, traditional private universities, are non-residential institutions. They're commuter schools. It means they live in they move from where they come from to go to the university and live there either in dormitories or in rental housing or in fraternities and sororities, right? That they travel to the place and stay there as opposed to just commuting. And most of the growth of higher education in the United States, higher education institutions, and the physical plant of higher education institutions is occurring in already populated areas and serving local clientele. The fastest growing sector of education in the United States is for-profit privates. And this has been growing really fast. University of Phoenix is probably the best known. National University is another. Capella University, DeVry University. These are all growing very, very fast. And they are offering highly tailored, essentially one-stop shopping opportunities. Many of these people are transfer students, so they fall into the going to two institutions. They'll go to community college and then they'll transfer to one of these. Some of them just come in and go straight through, in which case they would be the one institution baccalaureate people. Okay, so there's the question of, information technology. I said I would talk about this at some point. So let's, go back to my picture of knowledge infrastructure. And sort of the idea here is that increasingly information technology provides the means on which knowledge infrastructure floats. And this is true actually in the Praxis world as well as the epistemic infrastructure world. It happens in different ways. And it's easy to imagine that, what this means to things like e-science or cyber infrastructure. And that is all part of the puzzle. It's a legitimate piece of it. But what I want to concentrate on here is not so much the sort of current wave of experimentation that's going on. It's all very important. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I really want to concentrate on the issue of productivity and this concept of Baumol's disease. This was an idea that was developed in the 60s by William Baumol, an economist at NYU. Basically he was trying to figure out why the cost of certain kinds of activities just kept going up so quickly. And opera was one of the things he was interested in, but he was interested in others. And he had this quip, which kind of captured the notion, which was after 4 centuries of technological progress, it still requires 4 highly skilled musicians to play a string quartet, right? And so the idea was, if you kind of boil his argument down to its basic form, he said there's a real problem for sectors of production that aren't able to capture the productivity benefits that other sectors of production are able to capture, because they live and work in the same labor market as those sectors that are able to capture productivity benefits. And as a general rule, as productivity improves, the prevailing wage rates of the industries where productivity is improved have gone up, right? So if you're Grand Opera, you can't really increase your productivity very much, but you're going to be lifted by what's happening in the automobile sector or in the chip making sector or whatever. As the prevailing wage rates in the society rise, you're going to be carried up with them. You can't pay. Your costs are going to be carried up, and you can't pay a Grand Opera star $20,000 a year, right? Because this is a very, very highly specialized thing, requires a tremendous commitment of time and energy and effort. And those kinds of people, if you want to get the high-level talent, you're going to have to pay something that is affected by the prevailing wage rates in the society. So they may not be paid as much as top film actors, but they're going to be paid in that same general zone, right? So your costs are going to rise, but the audience that you reach, the revenues you can collect, are not going to rise commensurately. So you have to get sponsorships, you have to charge very high prices for tickets and so forth and so on. So the idea is, if you can't break the cycle, if you're stuck in the Baumol's cost disease problem, you've got a real difficulty breaking out. And I think it's fair to argue that higher education, and arguably education generally, has been kind of stuck in this Baumol's disease trap for quite a while. But I would argue there's reason to imagine that maybe things are changing. And so I just want to click through a bunch of pictures quickly here to frame this argument. There was a time not long ago, again staying in the music zone, where if you wanted to hear some music, you better be able to play a musical instrument, or you better be near people who did, because that's the only way you're going to get music. And as it happens, a very large fraction of the population could play musical instruments in comparison to the case today. Now we know what happened. We learned to record music, and then we learned to record it in ways that allowed those recordings to be shared, and originally through analog tape. And then we moved into the digital world so that those could be, the those recordings could be transmitted digitally. And then we moved to the point where that became very easy to do, and then it moved into things like peer-to-peer networks and Napster and so forth. And now you see people walking all around. It's not just at Michigan. I see it here at Oxford, these people walking around with white strings hanging out of their ears with their iPods on, and they are using music that they got very easily, kind of ubiquitously from information infrastructure. There was a time not long ago, in order to get your own money out of the bank, you had to go physically to the bank, stand in line probably, between very constricted hours of operation. So it was very inconvenient to go to the bank just to get your own money out of the bank. That all changed in the United States in 1978 when a ATM machine was installed in a Piggly Wiggly supermarket in Ohio, and set off an uproar. Is this a branch, et cetera. Nobody knew what the story was there, but now it's ubiquitous, right, everywhere you go. This is the way retail banking is done pretty much all around the world now. People get their money from robots, right? It's an automated system of distribution and exchange. Let's suppose that I, as a traveler, would like to know how to get from London Heathrow to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport tomorrow morning. Well, I just go to Expedia and look at the timetable search, and lo and behold, there's a flight, Northwest Airlines, 8:40 a.m., 10:02, and lo and behold, I go to my Northwest booking site, and I look at my reservations, and I'm on it, right? This is all done on the web, no intermediation of travel agents and so forth. It's in my hands. In fact, about the only thing I can think of that's moved away from machines and into humans and establishments is coffee, and that's one I haven't completely decoded yet. But overall, there's been this pretty conspicuous trend that's embodied in this wonderful public relations notion. Some of you remember the days of rotary dialing of telephones. Well, in order to move the population off of the operator-assisted telephone calls and onto automatic switching, they had to basically educate the population. One of the ways they did it was by that thing in the middle. It says here, wait for dial tone, and then there's a number, right? We used to pick up the phone and either crank it or it would automatically connect to the central office. There would be a human operator, and they'd say, give me so-and-so, or give me this number, this exchange, and an extension, and they would patch it through for you. But now you had to wait for dial tone. That was the new operator, and then you would dial this thing. These letters were put on to correspond to the names of the exchanges, not to facilitate short messaging. But in fact, they became very useful for that later on because they showed up on the very same keypad, right? It was a kind of path dependency, you might say. And there was this ad that ran, put out by the AT&T Bell system, that basically made the claim, if not for the automation of the telephone system, most of the population would have to be telephone operators, right? Because they did the math and figured out the number of calls are being made. You'd have to have huge numbers of operators. But the ironic thing is, of course, that most of the population are telephone operators, right? The whole idea of this automation was not only to make everybody a telephone operator, but to offload the entire operations of the telephone system onto the user population, right? So what's the story here? The story is that all ubiquitous infrastructure, networked infrastructure that's been built over the last 100 years has been moving toward the placement of operational authority in the hands of the end user. There's virtually no exceptions to this. So I do all my own airplane bookings. I do all my own shopping, right? I go straight to the supply chain when I shop online. This is a trend that's been happening. Now, let's come back to college for a second and see how this fits with the college story. There was a time when the concept of going away to college had meaning. That is, you left your home community and you went to another place and lived there. That's what it meant to go to college. So say a student from Traverse City, Michigan would come to Ann Arbor, move away from her home community and live in our academic community in residence for the large fraction of a year each year for 4 or 5 years, and then usually move on to some other community. And this is what we experienced, is that doesn't happen anymore. These people never leave. They are tethered to their home communities through ubiquitous communications access. They all have cell phones. They all have internet access. They all use short messaging. They have access to much less expensive and ubiquitously available transport infrastructure than they ever had before. What they are doing is bringing their existing social networks to Michigan with them. And what we haven't noticed at the University of Michigan is that by transitivity, our social network, our learning environment is now being extended to these extended networks. So, if you go to Facebook, and I am on Facebook, I felt it only fair to put a picture of me when I was an undergraduate up there. You'll notice that it's down the circle says, John has no friends at Michigan. But I do have a Facebook entry. Facebook is a huge phenomenon now, if you've been following that story. This generation of people are networked with each other in a humongous way. MySpace is exactly the same kind of phenomenon. This thing is washing over the more junior ranks of our institutions. Most of the faculty don't even know it's there, right? But this thing is absolutely huge. So I asked the question, how many students, okay, how many students are there in Michigan? In 1910, 3% of the population got baccalaureate degrees. In 2000, 26% of the US population got baccalaureate degrees. It was a big change, right? And it was done by dramatically altering the production system, the capability of doing that. Nominally, the University of Michigan Ann Arbor campus has 38,000 students. Well, how do you measure student population? We measure it by the number of people who enroll in our courses as registered students, right? And so you can do student credit hours, FTE, and other things, but just sort of straight up head count, it's about 38,000. But when you bring in this idea that all of these people have arrived at Michigan, bringing their own social networks with them, and then you began to realize that most of these people talk with those other people. And I've watched this with my son and my daughter, who are college students. They actually exchange a lot of information about what they're learning. Not just that, of course, but they exchange a lot of information about what they're learning. How many people are actually learning from the University of Michigan learning environment at any one time? 100,000? 200,000? We haven't even thought about this. We have no idea how many people are learning for the University of Michigan learning environment. And we sure aren't charging them. We're not even claiming them as benefits that are being rendered to the society. But a huge amount of this is going on. It's just not anywhere close to the measurement system, right? We look at the new affordances for communication, allow people to work across, place and time, collaboration technologies, and that kind of thing. We think about these things as being important, and they are. They are very important. They're going to extend what we're doing. We don't even see the rest of this that's going on kind of right under our noses. This is the whole distance learning thing. It's extending all over the place. This is, chat that's going on in distributed community on board a Lufthansa flight. The extension of access to knowledge, at least epistemic knowledge, it's imperfect, but it's there, is growing dramatically. This is just something that a bunch of students made at the University of Michigan called the Internet Public Library. It's an interesting thing. If you search for library, the word library, Internet Public Library owns the page rank for library ahead of Library of Congress. Not a bad accomplishment. This is now the world's largest site for school children doing science fair projects. Because we have a big science fair site that a couple of students made, right? It's sort of out of the blue and decided to do it. At one point, the Kellogg Foundation said, why don't you take this IPL source code and make it open source so it can be converted and used for other applications? And we have one in mind, which was the American Indian Higher Education Consortium Virtual Library. There's 34 tribal colleges in the United States. Most of them are community colleges. Some of them were losing their accreditation as community colleges because their library resources were too weak. They created the AHIC Virtual Library, and these institutions were accredited because they had the digital resources that at least got them above the line. This has now been expanded into Spanish language. Tec de Monterrey is the site for this. As you can see down at the bottom, there's the IPL and School of Information logo. They're part of our partners. We're just now expanding this to the United Arab Emirates College of Information Technology at the UAEU as an Arabic language node in the larger IPL. Wikipedia is a very interesting phenomenon. It's grown like crazy. One of the things I like about Wikipedia, if you have teenage kids who hang out on the internet, you'll probably have heard of somethingawful.com. It's humor. It's sophomoric humor by sophomores, right? So they try to, yeah, the pure thing. And so they make hilarious, scientists announce that pretty much everything can kill you, yuck, yuck. You go to Britannica, you go to Americana, there's not an entry on something awful, but there is on Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia has been growing very fast. Not too long ago, it passed the 1 million entries mark. Wikipedia now has more visits per day than the New York Times. Nature did a study a while ago. It's been disputed. Britannica's fighting back, but they basically did a study that said that overall the quality of the information on Wikipedia is not significantly lower than it is in other authoritative sources, which sort of poked a hole in one of the biggest complaints about it. Some of you are probably familiar with the concept of digital libraries. If you do a Google image search on the string digital library, you'll come up with pictures like this that include all kinds of important institutions of higher education and cultural heritage. And if you look in particular at this nexus, the Bodleian Library, University of Michigan, Harvard, Stanford, New York Public Library, etc., and Google, you find the Google Print Project. The Google Print Project is this retrospective conversion project that's scanning all of these books into digital databases, full text, searchable, etc. This is from today's Washington Post. Vint Cerf, who one of the fathers of the internet, now works for Google, as does almost everybody apparently, saying this is what we want to do, making the brief on behalf. This just appeared last Sunday in the New York Times Magazine. Kevin Kelly, big article about this. It's gaining traction, lots of IP issues and so forth and so on. Showing up in all kinds of other places. Political discourse is being dramatically influenced by this in the United States. Daily Kos, for example, now has more visitors than all but the top 5 metropolitan newspapers in the United States. It's a left-leaning political blog. There's of course right-leaning political blogs, blogs for Bush. These outfits read each other and flame on each other like crazy. Weblogs are growing dramatically, doubling in size approximately every 5 months. This is just new weblogs created per day, growing like crazy. Podcasting is another phenomenon that's moving extremely fast. This is English 102. I don't have the video on here, but you click on that, and it's a lecture, right? That's provided by South Mountain Community College, and podcast is available on iTunes. This is sort of podcast growth among consumers, growing very, very quickly in a very short period of time. A lot of activities going on in game sites, virtual reality sites like Second Life. A number of universities, including the University of Michigan, have bought land in Second Life, and this is going to be where our new campus will be located. E-student growth is going up. Number of students enrolling in online courses growing very quickly. And the states are starting to back this. Michigan Virtual University is a state-led thing. It started off to be a university. Their slogan was the 16th institution of public higher education in Michigan. They said that before they checked with the other 15, and soon discovered that K-12 was where their future lie, and that's what they're doing now. So where are we? So let's sort of wrap this up. Some interesting facts. From 1850 to 2000, literacy in developed countries moved very quickly. But in 2005, there were more illiterate people in the world than there were people in the world in 1850, right? Because of population growth. illiteracy is not by any means conquered. 4/5 of the world lives in poverty. The world's threatened by lots of things. The opportunities have never been greater. But one thing that most countries, the ones that are not ruled by insane despots, agree on, is that education is a really important piece of how to pull out of this. Follow the so-called bottom of the pyramid discussion. C.K. Prahalad and other people have been talking about this idea of coming up with new mechanisms to sort of help the 4/5 of the population of the world that lives in poverty to rise. The argument here, ultimately, is that changes in infrastructure alter access, and changes in access can alter agency, right? It changes the ability of people to act on their own behalf and particularly interact with other agents. And so my argument about this transformation, there's not much of a discussion about where I see things going. This is just a kind of mobilization of bias talk around the idea that things are already moving, that this is not a story about what's going to happen. This is a story about what's already happening. Something big is going on here. And of course, you can come back to this notion of decentralization, reallocation, and productivity. To sum up the sort of straight shot comment about all of this, it's that I believe that we are entering into an era of transformation in higher education that is going to be dramatic. And as I said in the abstract of this talk, my prediction is that it's going to be as dramatic over the next 25 years as the period from 1850 to about 1980 was. And that was the period when there was this huge change in the land-grant colleges and universities, GI Bill, the move from a very small single-digit fraction of the population receiving baccalaureate degrees to somewhere within striking distance of a third of the population receiving them. In some developed countries, it's higher than that. And just to give you some rough indicator of the policy bias here, the state of Michigan recently commissioned a big study called the Cherry Commission Report, in which they explicitly said that the goal of the state with respect to higher education is to double the number of people in the state who receive baccalaureate degrees from 22%, Michigan's a little actually on the low side, it's below the mean, to 45%. Now they're doing this at the same time they're cutting our budgets, right? So, you can't get there from here is the kind of general reaction. I'm not so sure that's true. If we look at this as a problem of linear speed up, there's no way it can happen. There's just not going to be the resources provided by the Commonweal to improve access at the current unit cost of delivery. But I think we're actually entering an era where we can quite dramatically change the unit cost of production. Not so much through distance learning. I think that's pretty brain dead, and we've been learning that, even though it's been growing quite quickly. I think that the next kind of breakout thing that's really going to change the game is what I call distributed learning. And distributed learning is dramatically facilitated learning by semi-self-organizing and self-organizing teams of people who want to learn by working together. And in a lot of cases, this is going to happen without the direct intervention or guidance of people in higher education, but facilitated dramatically by infrastructure built by higher education and made available to the population through very lightweight protocols. So, book clubs and hobby worlds and that sort of thing are already doing this in a huge way using information infrastructure like the web. And when you start adding in the sort of the blogosphere and you add in the Wikipedia notion and you start adding in the collaboration technologies and issues like the fact that this is being video recorded and can then be made available through streaming video and that sort of thing, this is all part of that fine-grained packaging that's starting to come together to change the modality of production. So I really appreciate your forbearance. I mean, this is a long kind of like, high-speed blurb about what's going on. But, this is sort of how I'm thinking about this set of problems right now.